All right, so let's dive into verse 6 of First Corinthians chapter 13. So I hope you recall how I mentioned in the previous talks that though love covers and believes all things, that it's not blind to evil, to wrong motives, or to failures, that it recognizes negatives but doesn't ignore them, but it chooses to believe what is good, either in the present or the future to come. Verse 6 may shine some light on our understanding of verse 7. But before we begin, we must understand how Paul is using the word love here. In this passage, love is not being used necessarily as a verb, as an action. For example, I love him or her. I love this way. But rather, love here is a noun. It's standalone. It's describing what love is. And so when he says love is, are these things or is this thing, he's saying love as a noun. So as we look at it, love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we're looking at the attributes of love. In other words, it's a way of saying that love is rather than love is doing. Okay, so a lot of times our ideas of love is that love is this action here, doing this here. But what Paul is basically saying in 1 Corinthians 13 is that love is or are this thing. It's the makeup of it. It's the attributes of it. Okay. So looking at verse 6, it reads, love, or it does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. When I read this, I think back many years ago, I was having lunch with a former student of mine, and we were reminiscing about the fun times in class, the jokes that they played on me, I played on them, the different characters within our class. And he talked about the silly times, but he also talked about the serious times. And he said, Mr. Campbell, in the course of our lunch, Mr. Campbell, I've got something to tell you. And you could see he was kind of apprehensive about it. I couldn't imagine what it could be, but I said, okay, shoot, go ahead, tell me. He shared with me how one of the other students in the class, who was a really good friend of his, would cheat on a lot of my tests, and not just my class, but in other classes as well. This really didn't surprise me a whole lot because this particular student wasn't the best student academically, but I was always surprised at how he pulled such really high marks, especially on tests and quizzes when he only did so much of the work. So this information really didn't surprise me. I asked the student, I said, well, what was your response to this? And I said it with a smirk, and, I wasn't upset in any kind of way. I just said, I kind of figured it, but what was your response to what he was doing? And he used to say, well, I would laugh and say, man, you should really stop this. But he said, I really just laughed it off and just shook my head. Well, he looks at me then and says, you won't guess what happened to him. And I said, well, what? Well, apparently he tried to do the same thing in college and it failed miserably. Well, when the professor found out that he was cheating, he, of course, brought it to the dean's attention, and the dean basically put him on academic probation. But because of this, he was placed on academic probation for an entire year, and he lost part of his scholarship for school. It hurt him a lot. He had to work in order to pay the other half that he had lost, and he had to retake that class. I asked him, well, how did this make you feel hearing this information? And he said, well, I kind of felt bad for him. And then he asked me this question. He said, do you think that if he had gotten caught in high school, that perhaps this wouldn't have happened in college? I looked at him and I said, well, I really don't know. That's hard to tell. I think it would have helped a little bit, but it's really hard to say whether or not he would have done the same thing. But I did tell him this. I think that if you had a louder voice, that it may have helped. In other words, if you had really insisted, man, you really need to stop doing this. This is not good. And insisted with all of your heart, it may have changed his whole attitude towards cheating. Who knows? When we look at verse 6, it plainly says that love isn't glad at the things that are wrong, right? It doesn't rejoice or revel in evil. The word wrongdoing in the Greek is ideikeia. All right, ideikeia, which means anything that is wrong in heart or in life. This can mean habits. This can mean bad decisions in the heat of the moment. This is kind of broad, right? It could be something that's going on in a person's heart or things that have happened to them in their past. And so they habitually act this kind of way. But it's saying here that love doesn't revel in those things. It doesn't rejoice in those things. It doesn't look at those things and say, yay, good for you. You got revenge on them for what they did to you. It doesn't do that. But rather, love always rejoices in what is right and what is good. What's interesting is that the first rejoice in the passage is singular, but the second one is plural, meaning that in the first rejoicing, it's a one-way street, right? Love doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing. That one-way street, that one person in that moment gets vindication. And so they act out or act on their emotions. And so that's what they do. And so in that moment, that person feels vindicated and alive and happy, but it's fleeting. It doesn't last long. And the love doesn't rejoice with that, but rather the second meaning, it rejoices in what is true, is a rejoice that is experienced together. But the first one is by itself. And that first rejoicing is very fleeting. Have you ever felt that way? Like you feel like you've gotten revenge or vindication on someone, and you did it with wrong motives, and it actually hurt the person, and you felt good about it in that moment, but ultimately you didn't bring any true vindication. Your heart might even felt a little heavy at it. A moment of self-reflection as we look at verse 6. Have you ever dismissed someone's actions as that's just how they are? Oh, that's crazy James over there. James just acts so crazy all the time, and you could fill in the name, and you just let them do what they do. And you know that it's hurting them, whether it's hurting them spiritually or emotionally or even physically, but you don't speak out. This may be hard for a lot of us to hear, but that way of love is not true love. It's not the real attributes of love to love that way. If I love you, I am going to rejoice in something. If I love you, I'm not going to rejoice in something that's going to bring your downfall. Even if it just brings your downfall way down the line and not in that present moment, I'm not going to rejoice in that, but rather I'm going to rejoice in what's going to bring you success, what's going to bring you joy, what's going to bring you love, hope. And so that's our thought with part 3 of this, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 6. I love you. God bless you. Praying for you. And like I said, if you find this as an inspiration, share this with friends, family, or whoever. Thanks. Until we see each other again. God bless.